Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. So before we work on the two little spreads for today's sketchbook session, some people had questions from like previous sketchbook spread videos or the one that I did last week in terms of how do I plan out my sketchbook spreads. And the easiest way for me to explain it is that I like to fill in the space of a sketchbook spread as much as possible, meaning that usually I start in one place and then I kind of fan outwards and then fill in the gaps. So for this particular spread, which I did last week, Ike right here is the first one that I did, and then we went this way. So because he's in the very front, then he would be next, but the remaining space, which would be this kind of backward 7 shape, I need to find poses that fit or think of poses that would fit or objects or text. So in this case, I filled in text here, even though I could put a character here and have them really cut off. But for this one, I decided to split it into 2 rather than leaving it kind of in an awkward pose if I really wanted to. So I stuck another kind of waist up-ish kind of Ike right here, and then we did one more headshot to fill in this tiny space. So I kind of went this way in terms of filling the space. But I do like filling in spaces either with like little doodles or little patterning or color blocking, anything like that to kind of fill in the space. So here's another one with Rainbow, and I had an awkward space here because I don't like drawing faces right on the seam. It was easier for me to put some kind of text here, this kind of center portion. Now I don't think my ways of doing sketchbook spreads are very unique. It's literally just fill in the space, just use up all the real estate on the paper. I've done this in previous sketchbook sessions too, or like other spreads. So this is a previous spread, random ones, but they kind of look nice because there's a lot of like kind of like overlapping, or the way how I position things makes sense. So we have one pose here when we're kind of like moving backwards, and you can see that kind of like if you vary up the sizes, it makes the spread look a little bit more interesting. Here's another example from, I don't remember, yeah, this is my previous sketchbook that we saw. So basically I started off with this walnut, and then I have this space to fill and this space to fill. So I did this one next, and then I believe I sketched this one next with the text, and then I had this awkward kind of, I guess it's like a good chunk of real estate for me to fill in, so I stuck in this kind of nice walnut kind of reaching over, and then filled up the space with some of these weird bubbles. So the drawing that I want to be kind of like front and center tends to be the one that I draw first. So even in this case, this is the Ike that I wanted to focus on. So I drew him the biggest, the largest, and kind of took up the most amount of space. And then every other one can be of less detail or less of a finish or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I think that's it. Let's go move on to the next 2 spreads because I think I've talked long enough about the sketchbook. So now we can actually move on to the sketchbook session for today. And I think I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be doing 2 spreads. So I actually mixed up the spread order. So we are going to be working on a kind of like more or less water-based marker spread, which is kind of like my favorite way to add color, also to do a lot of my sketches in my sketchbook, because I guess like the method or the way how I do them, I just think this looks like a nice cohesive page of a character usually. Or if I'm doing several characters, I still like to adhere to some sort of similar color palette throughout the whole spread. Then the second spread, I will be moving on to doing some watercolor painting or just coloring with like a few washes before we move on to like inking and everything. So I'll show you guys kind of 2 different sessions or methods of how I like to fill up spreads. But for this one, I think it's kind of like my most common way of filling up a spread, and I'm trying my best to show the entire process from the sketching portion, the coloring portion, and then the line work, so you get a better feel of how I tend to do the layout kind of visually rather than me just explaining after the fact. So I don't think I mentioned who I was going to be drawing. So for both of the kind of sessions that I'm going to do today, plus some of the extra sketches that you might see a little bit later, I am drawing another VTuber, and he's actually my favorite from the JP side of Niji-sanji, and his name is Kaida Haru, and I don't know, he's always been my favorite for quite a while. I've always listened to his like karaoke or kind of singing streams, I guess it might be a better way of putting it. He often plays acoustic songs and stuff because he plays the guitar, and I just love listening to it because I like a lot of the covers that he does, but if it's an acoustic version, I love it even more because I'm a big acoustic fan in terms of like covers or people doing their own versions. So I am doing kind of one of his newer outfits, which is more of a casual, almost like gamer-ish-esque kind of wear, but I wanted to include text. So like I mentioned earlier, sometimes if I am not going to fill up the entire page with just like headshots or poses or whatever you want visually, like of a character, I like adding like patterning or text. So one way you can add some kind of like unique text if you want to, I like to go on 1001fonts.com and you can just browse and filter out different kind of texts. So I kind of roughly followed one of the texts from this one. It's kind of more handwriting, hand lettering-ish, which is, I think that's the category I went with for this particular spread. So I'm going to show you guys a bit of an overview of the sketches. So for some reason, I've been really liking this pencil lead a little bit more than the Palette Color Eno. The Palette Color Eno is nice. It's a little bit more of a cooler red, and also I feel like it's a little bit lighter. But this one lays down so like nicely in a way. It feels like it lays down more like graphite rather than like this waxier-ish material. But moving on with the coloring. So I mentioned last week that I wanted to keep all my swatches and a lot of my color testing, everything like that, like color palette, swatches, all that in one place, just for me to have a easier time organizing and looking back at previous color combinations, but also just reducing the amount of scraps I use in terms of trying to think of color palettes and testing out colors to see what works with one another. So I've been using that sketchbook, and I've been using it to plan out the colors for this spread and a few of the other spreads that you've seen before. So I went back to using yellow and kind of either a teal or a turquoise or a light blue because I really like this color combination. But the yellow I wanted to use was actually going to be a little bit more on the cooler side and a little bit lighter than the one that I've chosen today. If anything, I would argue in terms of the value range for this yellow, it's closer to a mid-tone color rather than a lighter color, like on the brighter side of the scale, I guess. So this one became a little bit more streaky in a sense. So usually I don't mind because I am very aware that a lot of water-based markers are going to be streaky regardless, but I usually can get away with making things looking a little bit more blocky and less streaky when I use certain yellows because they are so bright and punchy, but it's okay. I decided to also pair this up with kind of a dustier, kind of greenish blue color that you'll see a little bit later, but I deliberately wanted to draw this particular Kaidaharu outfit was because I knew I wanted to use a lot of yellow in the spread. So his worked out really nicely. He also has kind of like bluish, like icy bluish eyes, I could say, and he has a little bit of white and a lot of black, so there's a lot of areas I could kind of play around with this kind of blue color. So even though I knew I liked the color combination, and for the most part, I try to limit the amount of colors that I wanted to use for today's spread. I am going to be including my line art color as one of the main colors because I'm going to be kind of like hatching in certain areas because I mentioned earlier that his outfit does have a good amount of black in it as well. But a lot of the white areas that are going to have shadow, I also added to his hair of that kind of like dustier greenish blue color. I just wanted to make sure that it's in several areas before I start doing the line work because I like doing line work last so that things don't smudge. So I wanted to make sure that I blocked in everything to the best of my ability in terms of what I think needs to be filled in. After that, we can switch over to line work. So I'm still working with the same water-based markers, but luckily these Magicfly markers are dual-ended, meaning that one side has the brush tip side, which is great for blocking in color, kind of chunking in larger spaces, but then the other side has a nice fine liner side, which is great because I love being able to have a large selection of colors, but then being able to utilize them for both coloring and for, I guess, like writing, for notes, for, I guess, line art in this case. It's just great to have that kind of versatility for one color. You can kind of use either end for it. So because of that, I actually haven't been using my Crayola markers all that much. Maybe I'll use them for a future video because that's kind of what started me using or like getting comfortable with using water-based markers in my sketchbook in a way that I didn't feel like felt too disruptive in terms of it being super streaky, because I know a lot of people don't like using water-based markers because you don't get that nice smooth kind of flat finish that you get from alcohol markers where everything blends really nicely. There's usually less streakiness, and you know, it's just not meant for the same things. I think water-based markers have their time and place for what you can use them for, and I think for like doodles and stuff, I definitely prefer using water-based markers over alcohol markers, just because it's a little bit easier to use and you don't have to worry about bleed through. And it's kind of fun being able to limit yourself to certain colors and pick, you know, certain colors to match with one another, rather than being able to constantly blend and make up new colors, or like have transitioning colors kind of buffer that choice, I guess. So whenever I choose a color for line work, I usually like choosing it as kind of like my final color for my color palette. So in this case, the kind of majority of the color that I wanted to work with was the yellow, hence the majority of the color of the spread is yellow. Then I want to have kind of like an accent color, which happens to be kind of like that grayish greenish blue color, and then after that I like to pick a line work color that also appears usually in the color palette, so in this case something similar to black, so I chose a dark gray. But for other color palettes where I don't really care about matching things and I only care about the value, I will try to match it to the color palette rather than the color palette of the character. So let's say I'm drawing like, I guess like Kokomi could be a good example, even though I feel like the colors that I would choose are still very much present in her color palette. So I would definitely choose pink and blue for my main colors for Kokomi, because that's like the most prominent colors in her outfit, you could argue, or you could say pink and purple, more or less. But for the line work color, I would like to pick a color that's like within the range of the pink and purple usually, or like the pink and blue. So whatever's like your main color and your accent color, I like to tailor the line work color to kind of fit it if it's not present in the overall color palettes. So for Kaida Haru's kind of overall look, I could have used the dark blue and I wouldn't have mind. I think it's dark enough that it would stand out from the yellow and could act as the black for the page, but it would also fit nicely with the kind of like light blue color. I feel like what would throw this off a little bit is if I chose a color that's significantly too warm, let's say like a very dark red, a very warm brown. It wouldn't fit exactly the best, but it wouldn't look too off, because I feel like the blue is still a little bit on the lighter side, that it could still mesh a little bit well with everything. But for the most part, I wanted to stick with something a little bit on the cooler side and dark enough to act as the black for his outfit. So that's usually how I like to plan out colors, and hopefully that all makes sense to some degree. So for the inking, you would have saw that during the slow kind of real-time portion, I was trying to show you guys that I tend to like darkening up and adding line weight to kind of make sure that things stand out from the big and bright colors from my initial color blocking. Then after that, I will go ahead and just do normal lines. I'll do a lot of hatching and shading where I feel like it fits. So a lot of the darker areas for Kaida Haru, I would actually do a lot of just filling in, but I wouldn't want to use the brush side because I wanted to treat it as just like line work and a little bit of texture rather than color blocking it in with the dark gray. I also just don't like filling a lot of my pages with very dark water-based marker colors just because they are the most streaky, I find. So it's a little bit harder for me to cover that up. I feel like when you have lighter to mid-tone colors and have such a bold or darker kind of line work color, you kind of draw the attention a little bit away from how patchy and streaky everything else looks, as long as your line art kind of keeps everything a little bit more cohesive, which is why I like to take a little bit of extra care when I can when I try to ink something like this. There's like some other spreads I've had in the past where I become very lazy with the inking, and it definitely doesn't cover up my, I guess, like mistakes or how jarring some of the streaks look for some of my colors when I color block. So if I can, I like to take my time for the inking. So that's what I tried my best to do here. So you can see that I'm trying my best to block out individual parts by adding line work, but I add a lot of it a lot of bits of shading here and there to kind of tie everything together. So I would add like clothing folds. If there's any dark areas, I'll make sure to fill that in like immediately. Then after that, I did decide to use the brush side and kind of do like a thicker outline for all of the little doodles. So now I'm showing you guys kind of the little overview or like little close-ups of each of the individual little doodles or sketches right here. So you can see that the inking really ties everything together, and I definitely think it helps that the line work is kind of the darkest color of my color palette for this one. It also helps that the other colors are fairly bright and kind of more on the lighter side anyways. But I think this one actually turned out pretty cute, and I'm glad that I wasn't too lazy in terms of doing the line work. So moving on to the second session, which was actually planned to be the first one that I was going to show you guys before the water-based markers, in terms of I did the spread first before doing the other one. So my plan was to show you guys my sketching portion all the way up till I start doing the inking, but I still follow the same method of starting in one area and we kind of fan outwards a little bit and try to fill up as much of the spread or the page as I can. So I don't mind if there's things that are overlapping or if things are getting cut off. I just want to fill up the space as much as I can at this point. So I'm still drawing Kaidaharu from Niji Sanji, and I decided to draw him in his more usual outfit. And the reason being is that this color palette is a little bit hard for me to kind of like pick out colors technically, because his hair is actually more of a kind of like a neutral light blondish grayish color, if I could say, and his outfit is majority kind of like black, dark gray, teal, and red is probably the best way of describing it. He also has a bit of white, but it's a little bit hard for me to be as decisive in terms of picking what colors I wanted to have for his color palette. I probably would pick 3 colors plus a line art color to be dark, which will probably be that same dark gray. But you can see here, this is kind of what I ended up with. So instead of doing water-based markers, I am switching over and doing watercolors because it will allow me to have basically all the colors I want at my disposal without having to pick and choose. Because sometimes when I play with kind of like water-based markers and I add too many colors, it goes into that weird zone of I'm matching colors too closely to the original palette, but so many things are slightly off or not filled in all the way that it looks very incomplete, which I don't really like, and is kind of the reason why I like to limit my color palette and kind of make do with, oh, if something's kind of on the lighter side, I'll use one of my lighter colors to fill that in and kind of like pick and choose which ones fit more better visually or fit better more for the value rather than like color accuracy. I don't know if it made complete sense, but hopefully it made a little bit of sense that you guys understand what I mean. I think it's like you take up the colors to a certain point where it kind of feels like, why didn't you fill in the rest, rather than just filling it in a little bit of the way. So it just feels like it needs that extra push. So instead I decided that I would just use the watercolor, fill in as much colors as I would like, and I didn't have to really worry about that. But this method that I like to do in previous sketchbooks, I have not done recently. So I would actually paint kind of like with a watercolor wash for everything. Then after that, I would actually pick up a dark ink. So I'll show you guys that I'm using my Uniball Vision needle in the size micro, and I'm just using a black ink, but I feel like because I let the ink or the pen sit with the kind of like the needle pointing downwards, a lot of the ink was actually pooling very freely. So I switched over to my Staedtler liquid point, which was used to be kind of like my go-to pen in terms of doing inking in this kind of method, because it produced thin enough lines that I liked. But the problem is that ever since I switched doing, I think, using my notebooks as my sketchbook, this pen did not like to dry at all. So that's why I'm using a kind of paper to shield away his face so that I don't accidentally smudge anything. After that, I kind of switched back to the Uniball Vision needle once again, because as much as I didn't like the pooling of the ink, I just needed to use it a little bit more, and it kind of thinned out slowly, so it's a little bit more manageable for me to use. So here's kind of the overall spread. I really do like using this method in terms of using a very dark ink on top because one, it's fun to play around with ink like this every so often. I definitely need more practice working with ink anyways for line work. But it's a nice way to make your spread kind of pop out a little bit more because the black stands out a lot from the watercolor washes. So here's the kind of like second spread, but technically it's the first spread. So I'll show you guys back to this one, which is the kind of yellow and blue. And then we have this one, which is the watercolor. And then I have another spread here, which I did not show the process of, but this was just done with graphite and a little bit of accent colors with the water-based markers. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video and watching me do a few spreads in my sketchbook once again. And I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!